There is a photograph almost everyone carries of this place, even people who have never been here. A single road, thin as a pencil line, curving through a valley the color of rust and moss. No houses, no fences, no people. Just the road, the hills, and a sky that cannot decide whether to rain. It is one of the most photographed emptinesses on Earth, and almost everything the photograph tells you is a kind of lie. Because the emptiness is the story, not the backdrop to it, the emptiness itself. This is the Scottish Highlands, roughly 10,000 square miles of mountain, bog, loch and coast in the north of a small island off the edge of Europe. It is one of the least densely populated regions in all of Europe, emptier in places than Lapland, up near the Arctic Circle. Drive the single-track roads of the far northwest, and you can go for miles without passing another car, another roof, another living soul. The land feels ancient and untouched, as though it has always looked this way, as though people were simply never meant to live here. And yet, scattered across those empty glens, if you know how to look, are the outlines of houses, low rectangles of tumbled stone, half swallowed by heather. Rows of them, sometimes dozens together, following the curve of a stream. Field walls that fence in nothing. A rowan tree growing where a doorway used to be. These are not natural features. They are the foundations of homes. And once, not so very long ago, these silent valleys were full of the sound of people. So here is the question this documentary is built around. If these glens were full, and now they are empty, where did everyone go? And why, in a handful of these same valleys, are people quietly coming back? Because that is the part almost no one knows. That in some of the emptiest corners of Britain, the population line has stopped falling and started, very slowly, to climb. This is Scotland, and this is the story of who lives in the Highlands, why so many were made to leave, and what it takes to fill a glen back up. Let us begin with a number that seems to contradict itself. The Scottish Highlands are emptying. That is true, and the evidence is stark. In one stretch of the far northwest, the district of Coigash and northwest Sutherland, the population has fallen to a historic low of just over 3,200 people, down almost 9% in 20 years. A report by economists in 2025 described the area as locked in a spiral of decline so advanced it was not an exaggeration to call it an existential crisis. Of 7 primary schools studied, rolls had fallen by an average of 30% in little over a decade. In the village of Durness, pupil numbers dropped by 91%. Kinlochbervie High School, built for 182 students, now serves fewer than 28. And at the very same time, the Scottish Highlands are growing. The area around the inner Moray Firth, the fertile eastern coast where the city of Inverness sits, has been gaining people for years. New housing estates, new industry, a working-age population being deliberately drawn in. Both of these things are true. Both are happening right now under the same single word: the Highlands. It is one name laid over 2 opposite realities, and the postcard shows you neither of them. Understand that contradiction, and you understand almost everything about this place. The land you think of as timeless and wild is nothing of the sort. It is a landscape shaped, emptied, and now slowly reshaped by very deliberate human choices. The wilderness is not the absence of a story, it is the residue of one. To find where the people went and where a few of them are returning, we have to travel across the whole of the north, through the Crofting townships of the islands, where the old way of living on the land never fully broke, through the pine forests, where a native cat is being pulled back from the edge of extinction, through a tourist road that pours strangers and money into fragile villages every summer, and out to a small island 10 miles off the coast, where the people did something almost no one thought possible. They bought back the ground beneath their feet. But every one of those stories begins in the same place, with the emptying. So that is where we start, in the county where the wilderness was made. This is Sutherland, the far north of the Scottish mainland, a vast, thinly peopled county of moorland and mountain and long sea lochs, so empty today that you can drive its interior roads for an hour and see more deer than human beings. It is beautiful in the way that grief is quiet. And to understand why it looks the way it does, you have to go back to a single turning point in the middle of the 18th century. In the 1700s, the land here did not belong to individuals in the way we understand ownership now. It belonged, in a sense, to the clan. The word comes from the Gaelic for children. A clan was not simply a bloodline, it was a web of loyalty and obligation, with a chief at the center who held the land, and in return for rent paid in money, in goods, and in military service, gave his people protection and a place to live. Beneath the chief were the tacksmen, who managed parcels of land and sublet them. And beneath them were the ordinary people, living not in isolated farms, but in townships, clusters of houses shared between many families who worked the surrounding land together in scattered strips and grazed their animals on the common hill ground above. These townships were not empty, they were dense. A single glen that holds a handful of sheep today might once have supported 100 people or more. They spoke Gaelic, they farmed cattle, they cut peat for their fires and stacked seaweed into the soil to make it grow. It was a hard life, and often a poor one. But it was a life rooted in a specific place, going back generations. And then, in 1746, on a bleak moor near Inverness called Culloden, that whole world began to come apart. The Battle of Culloden was the final defeat of the Jacobite Rising, a failed attempt to put a rival king back on the British throne. The details of the battle matter less for our story than what came after it. In the aftermath, the British state set out to dismantle the clan system entirely. The things that held Highland society together, its weapons, its dress, in some cases, its very language, were suppressed. Estates whose owners had backed the losing side were seized and handed to new landlords. And a new idea took hold among the people who now owned the land. The idea that the Highlands were not a home for people, they were an asset, and an asset should turn a profit. The profit, it turned out, was in sheep. A new breed had arrived, a large, hardy sheep that could survive the Highland winter on the open hill, and whose wool and meat could be sold south for real money. In Gaelic, they were called na cuireadh móra, the big sheep. And the arithmetic was brutally simple. A glen full of people paying small rents was worth far less than a glen full of sheep. The people, in the cold logic of the new economy, were in the way. So they were removed. What followed is known as the Highland clearances. It happened in waves across roughly a century from around 1750 to 1860, and in Sutherland, it reached a scale that is difficult to hold in the mind. On the estates of the Sutherland family, in the years between 1811 and 1821, an estimated 15,000 people were cleared from the interior straths to make room for the sheep. 15,000 people, and in their place, around 200,000 sheep. The methods were not gentle. Families were given notice to quit the homes their grandparents had built. When some refused or were slow to go, the roofs of their houses were pulled down and, in a number of documented cases, set on fire, so there would be nothing to return to. Old people were carried out of burning buildings. Whole communities that had stood for centuries were emptied in a single season. The people were not, for the most part, sent away entirely. Not at first. They were moved, pushed off the good inland grazing and resettled on the coast, on narrow strips of poor, rocky ground. These new small holdings were called crofts. Each croft was deliberately made too small to live on by farming alone. That was the point. A family that could not feed itself from its croft would have to work as well, gathering and burning seaweed to make kelp for industry, or fishing the cold seas, earning the cash to pay the rent. They had been turned, in the space of a generation, from farmers with a share in a glen into labourers clinging to the edge of the land. And even that was not the end of it. When the price of kelp collapsed and the herring failed, and a blight rotted the potato crop that the crofters had come to depend on, a second wave of clearance followed, roughly between 1825 and 1855. This time, many landowners did not merely move their tenants. They removed them from the Highlands altogether, sometimes paying for their passage onto ships bound for Canada, Australia, and America, to be rid of them for good. In 1851, on the island of Barra, a small township called Balnaboduc, home to fewer than 30 people, was marked for clearance. Hired men moved through the houses, and the tenants were dragged down to the harbour, and from there put on boats. That was one township, on one estate, in 1 year. Multiply it across 100 years and 100 glens, and you begin to grasp the size of what happened here. This is the origin of the emptiness in the photograph. The silent, beautiful valleys of Sutherland are silent because the people who lived in them were forced out, so that the land could be given to sheep. The wilderness that draws visitors from all over the world is, in large part, a monument to one of the largest forced displacements in the history of Western Europe. It is worth sitting with that for a moment, because it changes what you are looking at. The next time you see that photograph, the empty glen, the lonely road, you might notice the low green rectangles in the grass and know that they were homes. For a long time, the people of the Highlands had no legal defense against any of this. A landlord could evict a tenant more or less at will. There was no security, no right to stay, no court to appeal to. Until at last, there was. In the 1880s, after decades of suffering and a series of protests by crofters who finally refused to be moved, the British government was forced to act. A royal commission was sent north to hear the crofters' grievances, and in 1886, Parliament passed a law called the Crofters' Holdings Act. For the first time, it gave the crofters of the Highlands 3 things they had never had. Security of tenure, meaning they could not simply be evicted. the right to a fair rent set by a court rather than a landlord, and the right to pass their croft onto their children. It sounds modest, a small piece of Victorian legislation about tenancy. But remember this law, because more than a century later, in a way almost no one in 1886 could have imagined, it would help make it possible for the people of the Highlands to do something extraordinary. Not just to stay on the land, but to own it. Hold that thought. We will come back for it. To see what the crofters were fighting to protect, we have to leave the mainland and cross the water to the long chain of islands that lie off the northwest coast. The Outer Hebrides, 130 miles of island, from the Butt of Lewis in the north to the beaches of Barra in the south, standing full in the path of the North Atlantic. These islands are, in one sense, the hardest place in Scotland to make a living from the land. The soil is thin, the wind is relentless, trees struggle to grow. The rock, some of the oldest exposed stone anywhere on the planet, breaks the surface everywhere, grey and glacier-scoured. And yet it is here, on this unpromising ground, that the old way of living has survived most completely. Because the Hebrides are the heartland of crofting, and crofting, which began as a system designed to keep people poor and dependent, became, over time, something else. A way of holding a community together on land that would otherwise empty out entirely. Here is how it actually works and why it matters. A croft is a small area of enclosed land, often just a few acres, held by a single family. On the better ground near the house, the crofter grows what they can and keeps a few animals. But the real key is the land beyond. The rough hill ground, the common grazing, which is not divided up at all. It is shared. Every crofter in the township has the right to graze their sheep or cattle on the common land, and the township manages it together, deciding how many animals it can bear, maintaining the fences and the drains, working as a single unit, even though each family holds its own small plot. It is a way of surviving on marginal land that a single farm could never manage alone. And the crofters improved that land by hand, over generations, with a patience that is hard to imagine now. On ground too wet and peaty to plough, they built what are called lazy beds. They cut long strips of turf and stacked them in raised ridges, layering seaweed in between to feed the soil, so that the water would drain away and something could grow where nothing had grown before. Walk the Hebrides today and you can still see them. Long, parallel ridges running down the hillsides, like the ghost of an old corduroy, marking ground that human hands made fertile a century and more ago. This is the persistence that the emptiness hides. Not a grand monument, a pattern of ridges in the grass, and a handful of families still working common ground the way their great-grandparents did, in a language their great-grandparents spoke. Because language, too, has survived out here, and its survival is one of the strangest and most hopeful stories in the whole of the North. The language of the Highlands and Islands is Gaelic, a Celtic tongue, cousin to Irish, that arrived in Scotland around 1500 years ago and, for a long stretch of the medieval period, was spoken across most of the country. For centuries, it was the everyday language of these glens and islands. It was the language of the townships that were cleared. And as the people were removed and scattered, and as English became the language of school, of law, of getting on in the world, Gaelic retreated. It was pushed to the western edge, to the islands, and there it was expected, slowly, to die. Today, there are only around 60,000 people in Scotland who speak it, and more than half of them live here, in the Highlands and Islands, with the Outer Hebrides and the Isle of Skye as the last true strongholds, the places where you can still walk into a shop and hear it spoken across the counter. But here is the curious thing. Gaelic is not simply fading anymore. In some places, it is being deliberately, stubbornly brought back, and by people who never spoke it as children. To see it happening, we cross to the largest of the Inner Hebrides, the Isle of Skye, an island of black, jagged mountains, the Coolin and green peninsulas reaching out into the sea like fingers. Skye draws visitors by the million now for its scenery, but in the quiet south of the island, in a district called Sleat, something else is going on. Here stands a college called Sabal Mór Ostaig, the national centre for the Gaelic language and culture. Students come from across Scotland and beyond to study entirely through the medium of Gaelic, to earn degrees in a language that was supposed to be gone by now. And across the Highlands, a system of Gaelic medium education has taken root, where children are taught almost every subject in the language. What is remarkable is who those children are. Around 80% of them come from homes where no Gaelic is spoken at all. Their parents cannot speak it, and yet the children grow up fluent, learning a tongue that skipped a generation or two and carrying it forward anyway. Think about what that means. A language does not usually come back once it starts to go. The pattern, almost everywhere in the world, runs one way, toward loss. And yet here, in the same islands that were emptied of Gaelic speakers by the clearances, new speakers are being made on purpose in classrooms from families who chose it rather than inherited it. It is a small thing, measured against the tide of English pouring in through every screen and speaker.
But it is a choice.
And it is the opposite of surrender. You hear the same current elsewhere on the islands, in the annual festival of Gaelic song and poetry called the Mode. In the bilingual road signs that now stand at every junction in the Highlands, the old Gaelic names restored alongside the English. In a dedicated Gaelic television channel broadcasting to the whole country. None of it guarantees the language's future, but all of it says the same thing that the lazy beds in the grass say and the Crofting townships say. This place is not finished. It is still deciding what it wants to be. And that argument over what the Highlands are for and who they belong to runs right through the land itself, even through the wild animals that live in it. Because the Highlands are not only a story about people. Across these mountains and forests and coasts lives some of the most remarkable wildlife in Britain. And in almost every case, the story of that wildlife is the same story as the land, a story of loss and of stubborn, deliberate return. Consider the golden eagle. It is the great predator of these skies, a bird with a wingspan approaching 7 feet that hunts the open hill for hares and grouse and the occasional young deer. Golden eagles pair for life, and a mated pair will use the same nest, an enormous structure of branches called an eyrie, built high on a remote cliff or in an old pine, returning to it year after year, adding to it, repairing it, so that a single nest may be used across many generations of birds. There is something in that worth pausing on. A home, high on a cliff face, rebuilt and handed down, occupied long after the human homes in the glen below fell silent. The eagle kept its place. The people were the ones who had to leave. Consider the pine marten, a slim, cat-sized member of the weasel family, chestnut brown with a pale throat, that lives in woodland and hunts by night, as happy in the branches as on the ground. For a long time, the pine marten was persecuted almost to extinction across Britain, surviving only in the remotest corners of the Highlands. but it has done something quietly hopeful. Without being reintroduced, without human hands carrying it anywhere, it has begun spreading back into woodlands it was driven out of, reclaiming lost territory on its own. Recovery, in its case, not by rescue, but by simple return, given a little space and a little peace. And consider the freshwater pearl mussel. It is easy to overlook because it lives hidden on the beds of clear, fast Highland rivers, a dark oval shell among the gravel. But it is one of the longest-lived creatures in Britain, capable of surviving for more than a century, and it is exquisitely sensitive. It can only live in water of the very highest purity, which makes it a kind of living gauge. Where the pearl mussel survives, the water is clean beyond almost anything the modern industrial world can offer. It is a survivor from an older, cleaner age, hanging on in the cold rivers of the north, asking nothing of us except that we do not spoil the water it needs. And it is not only the animals that hold the north together. Spread across the far interior of Caithness and Sutherland lies something most visitors drive past without ever knowing it is there. The flow country, the largest expanse of blanket bog in Europe, a vast, waterlogged wilderness of peat that has been forming layer upon layer for thousands of years. It looks at a glance like wasteland. It is nothing of the sort, because peat is made of dead plants that fell into water too starved of oxygen to let them rot. So instead of decaying, they accumulated, holding their carbon locked inside them. And they have gone on accumulating for so long that the flow country now stores more carbon than all the forests of Britain combined. An emptiness that looks like nothing, quietly doing one of the most important jobs on the island. It is a reminder that in the Highlands, what appears empty is almost never truly empty. There is always more going on beneath the surface than the eye can see. But no animal here carries the weight of loss and the hope of return quite like one. Britain's last native cat. To find it, we travel inland and south to the heart of the mainland Highlands, where a great range of rounded mountains rises above the pine. This is the Cairngorms, the largest national park in Britain, and around its edges lies some of the most important surviving woodland in the country. These are the last remnants of the Caledonian forest, the ancient wood of Scots pine that once covered much of the Highlands before it was cut and burned and grazed away over thousands of years. The Scots pines that remain are extraordinary trees, some of them 300 years old, their bark flaking to a warm russet, their crowns spreading flat and wide. They are living monuments, and the ecosystem they hold is one of the richest in Britain. This is home to the red squirrel, the crested tit, the capercaillie, a huge black grouse the size of a turkey, and still, just barely, the Scottish wildcat. The wildcat looks at a glance like a large, muscular tabby, but it is not a domestic cat gone wild. It is a genuinely wild animal, a subspecies that has lived in these forests since long before Britain was an island, fierce and solitary and almost impossible to tame. And it came within a whisker of vanishing entirely. Not this time mainly through hunting, through something stranger. The wildcats began breeding with the feral domestic cats that spread across the countryside, and each generation of hybrids diluted the wild bloodline a little further, until pure Scottish wildcats had all but disappeared from the landscape. A species being erased not by death, but by dilution. And so, in the summer of 2023, conservationists tried something bold. In the Cairngorms, a batch of 19 Scottish wildcats bred in captivity for exactly this purpose, was released into the wild. Fitted with tracking collars, watched anxiously from a distance, they were set loose to hunt and fend for themselves, and it was hoped to breed and begin rebuilding a wild population from almost nothing. One young male did something that captured the whole strange drama of it. He set off from his release site and traveled roughly 18 miles across the mountains in under 3 days, scaling cliffs, crossing summits, following rivers down into the glens. A true-born Scottish wildcat, once again stalking the Highlands under his own power. Remember those 19 cats? Whether they take hold, whether the wild bloodline survives, is a question that will be answered not this year, but over the years to come. But for the first time in a long time, the answer is not simply no. And here we arrive at the deepest argument in the modern Highlands. Because this land, emptied of so many people 2 centuries ago, is now the subject of a fierce disagreement about what it should become. And the disagreement has everything to do with who owns it. Scotland has one of the most concentrated patterns of land ownership anywhere in the developed world. A very small number of people own a very large share of it. And in recent decades, some of the largest Highland estates have passed into the hands of wealthy owners with a particular vision. Not sheep, not deer stalking, rewilding. The idea is to reverse centuries of damage, to let the overgrazed hills recover, to plant and regenerate the lost pine forest, to bring back missing species, and eventually, perhaps, even to restore the great predators that once lived here, the lynx, and further off, the wolf. On some estates, the results are already visible. Young forest climbing back up bare hillsides, golden eagles returning, rivers running cleaner. On its own terms, it is a remarkable act of repair. One landowner alone, now the largest private landholder in Scotland, has bound together a chain of estates with the explicit goal of healing the land over a span of 200 years. But not everyone in the glens sees it as healing, because among the people who still live and work on this land are crofters and farmers, the descendants in many cases of those who survived the clearances. And to some of them, the sight of a distant, immensely wealthy landowner deciding to empty the hills of sheep and fill them with trees and wild animals lands in a very particular and painful way. They have heard this before. A rich proprietor, often from elsewhere, remaking the Highlands according to a grand idea, with the people who actually live there given little say. When beavers were released into the Cairngorms, when wildcats were set loose, some of the farmers and crofters felt not wonder, but anger. Their fear is old and specific, that once again, decisions about this land are being made over their heads, that the Highlands are being remade as a wilderness for others to admire, and that they, the people, are once more in the way. There is no easy resolution to that. Both things can be true at once. The land genuinely needs healing, and the people who live on it genuinely deserve a voice in how. It is the oldest question in the Highlands wearing new clothes. Who is this place for? And who gets to decide? Which brings us at last to the most hopeful answer anyone here has found. An answer that runs straight back to that modest Victorian law we were asked to remember. The idea that the people of the Highlands might not simply live on the land or work it or fight over how it is used, but own it, themselves, together. The idea began of all places in Sutherland, the same county where the clearances fell hardest. In the far northwest, on a wild and rocky coast of scattered lochans and strange, isolated mountains, lies a district called Assynt. And in the early 1990s, the crofters of North Assynt did something that had never been done. The estate they lived on, some 21,000 acres of it, was put up for sale, as Highland estates so often were, as a commodity to be traded between distant owners. The crofters could have watched it change hands, as their ancestors had watched for 200 years, and simply hoped the new landlord would be kinder than the last. Instead, they decided to buy it. Not as individuals, as a community together, purchasing their crofts and their common grazings as a single unit, and taking ownership of the very ground they had always worked but never held. It is 1993. A committee of crofters, ordinary people, shopkeepers and shepherds and retired teachers launches a public bid to buy their own homeland. There is no guarantee it will work. The money must be raised. The sale is uncertain, protracted, nerve-wracking, played out in the newspapers and on television across Scotland. And then, against the odds, it succeeds. The people of Assynt win the land. The moment they succeeded, something changed in the whole country, because they had proved it could be done. That a Highland community did not have to be a passive tenant on its own ground, that it could take control of its own future. The televised drama of the Assynt bid caught a national mood, a sense after long years that the old order of Highland landlordism did not have to last forever. Remember Assynt, because the crofters who did it next were watching, and they took courage from it. But before we follow that courage out to sea, we have to reckon with a more recent force reshaping these same fragile coasts, one that arrives every summer in tens of thousands of cars. In 2015, the Tourism Board of the North Highlands launched a new idea. They took the existing roads that loop around the far northern coast, from the city of Inverness up and around the very top of the mainland and back, and they gave the route a single, marketable name: the North Coast 500. 516 miles of coastal driving past beaches and sea cliffs and mountains and distilleries, sold to the world as one of the great road trips of Europe. And the world came. Visitor numbers to the far north climbed steeply. For the region's economy, long starved of opportunity, it was a genuine lifeline. Cafes, guest houses, campsites, filling stations all found new custom pouring past their doors. Money flowed into some of the emptiest and poorest parts of the country, carried on the wheels of hired camper vans. But a lifeline can also be a strain. The single-track roads of the far northwest were built for a scattering of local traffic, not for a summer flood of visitors unused to passing places and blind summits. Villages of a few dozen people found themselves overwhelmed in the high season. The very emptiness and quiet that the tourists came to experience began in places to buckle under the weight of them experiencing it. And crucially, much of the money passes through. A car that drives the route in a few days sleeps in a different glen each night and leaves little behind in any one of them. The road brings life, but it does not by itself bring residence. It fills the highlands with people who are only passing through. And that is the difference that matters in the end, between a place that people visit and a place where people live, between an emptiness that fills up for a fortnight in July and a glen that gains a family who stays. Which is why, to find the deepest answer to our question, we have to leave the mainland behind entirely and cross 10 miles of open water to a very small island. But before we do, a word about the emptiness we are leaving, because even that deserves a second look. Drive south through the Western Highlands, and you pass through what many consider the most sublime landscape in Britain, Glen Coe, a deep valley walled by dark, near-vertical mountains, so grand and severe that it silences the people who drive through it. Beyond it stretches Rannoch Moor, 50 square miles of bog and pool and heather, treeless, roadless in its heart, seemingly the purest wilderness imaginable. And yet it too is not what it seems. That treeless moor was once wooded. That empty, sublime glen was once populated, and its most famous moment in history is a massacre in 1692 when soldiers turned on the families who had sheltered them. The wildness that visitors photograph as untouched nature is once again, in large part, a human creation. Land stripped of its forest by centuries of grazing and stripped of its people by clearance and hardship. The emptiness looks eternal. It is anything but. It is a wound that the heather has grown over so beautifully that we mistake it for the natural state of things. So, hold all of it in your mind now. The burned townships of Sutherland, the lazy beds of the Hebrides, the children learning a language their parents lost, the 19 wildcats, the crofters of Assynt who bought back their own ground, and the great, empty glens that were never truly empty at all. Hold all of it, and come out to the island where the whole story turns.
It is called Eigg,
a small island in the Inner Hebrides, 10 miles off the coast to the south of Skye, about 5 miles long and 3 miles wide, crowned by a single dramatic ridge of rock called An Sgúr, that rises like a fin above the sea. For most of the 20th century, Eigg was owned, as so much of the Highlands was, by a succession of private landlords. And for the people who actually lived there, that ownership was a slow disaster. The island passed from owner to owner like a curiosity. One bought it and neglected it. Another sold it on. The residents, meanwhile, lived under a kind of permanent insecurity, unable to invest in homes they did not control, unable to plan for a future that any new proprietor might overturn on a whim. Houses fell into disrepair because no one had the security to fix them. Young people left because there was nothing to hold them and no way to build a life. By the 1990s, the population of Eigg had dwindled to around 60 people. The island was, in the language of the mainland, emptying, following the same long curve downward that so much of the Highlands had followed for 2 centuries. And then the islanders remembered Assynt. They had watched, as the whole country had watched, the crofters of Assynt buy back their own land. And they thought, if they can do it, why not us? The idea had in fact been planted years before by a remarkable man, a crofter and free thinker named Tom Forsyth, who had spent his life on the western coast pursuing a vision of Highland life built on community, ecology, and renewal, and who had registered the very first trust with the dream of buying Eigg for its people. For years, it had seemed a fantasy. After Assynt, it began to seem possible. So the residents of Eigg, together with the Highland Council and the Scottish Wildlife Trust, formed a body called the Isle of Eigg Heritage Trust, and they launched a bid to buy their own island. They had almost no money of their own. What they had was a story and the nerve to tell it. They took their campaign to the wider world. They asked, in effect, for help. And the world answered. Donations came in from across Scotland and far beyond it, from strangers who had never set foot on the island and never would. Ordinary people, moved by the idea of a community trying to win back its own home. Small gifts and large ones accumulated until the islanders had raised the astonishing sum they needed, roughly £1.5 million, the entire purchase price gathered from the public, topped up by a modest grant. It is the 12th of June, 1997. On a small island in the Hebrides, a few dozen people stand together as the ownership of the ground beneath their feet passes, for the first time in the island's recorded history, into their own hands. They call it their Independence Day. They still mark it every year. Now think back. 200 years earlier on the mainland, men with the law behind them pulled the roofs off Highland homes and drove the people out so the land could be given to sheep. And here, on the 12th of June, 1997, the people took the land back, not by force, by raising the money, one donation at a time, to buy it. And the legal foundation that made it possible, the right of a crofting community to purchase the land it works, reached all the way back to that modest law of 1886, the Crofters' Holdings Act, the small Victorian defence against eviction that had quietly grown over a century into a tool for taking ownership. The law that once merely let them stay had become the law that let them own. And here is the number that answers everything this documentary set out to ask. When the islanders bought Eigg, the population was around 60 and falling. Today, it is around 110. It nearly doubled. On an island that had been emptying for decades, the line turned and climbed. Because ownership changed the arithmetic of staying. Once the community controlled the land, it could build new homes, and did, deciding together where they should go. It could invest in the future, because the future finally belonged to the people living in it. It built its own electricity grid, powered by wind, water, and sun, so that an island once at the mercy of distant owners could power itself. Young families arrived or returned. Children were born. A place that the 20th century had written off as finished began, quietly, to grow. Eigg lit a fuse. Its buyout following Assynt's helped inspire a steady flow of others across the Highlands and Islands. In the decades since, community after community has taken ownership of its own land, until hundreds of thousands of acres of the Highlands have passed into local, accountable hands. Giga in the south, Knoydart, the remote peninsula, estates in Lewis, in Harris, in Sutherland itself, the very heartland of the clearances, where communities have bought back the townships their ancestors were driven from. It is not a flood. It is not most of the Highlands, not remotely, but it is a reversal, a slow, deliberate, unmistakable reversal of a 200-year decline. That is the answer to the question in the photograph. The empty glen with the lonely road is real. The emptying is real, and in the far northwest, it is still happening. Still an existential crisis. Still a school built for 182 children holding fewer than 30. None of that is undone, but it is not the whole truth, and it is not the only future. Because a few miles away, on an island off the coast, the people did the thing that 2 centuries of history said was impossible. They filled a glen back up. They owned the ground, and they stayed. So when you see that photograph now, the one almost everyone carries, the single road curving through the empty, rust-colored glen, you will know how to read it. You will know that the emptiness was made, not born. That the low green rectangles in the grass were homes, and the people in them were driven out so the land could be given to sheep. You will know that the wildness is a wound, grown beautiful. And you will know something else, that the single word Highlands hides two opposite truths still today. In the far northwest, the emptying goes on, the young leaving, the schools shrinking, a way of life running down towards silence. And in the same breath, in the city on the eastern firth, and on a scattering of islands and estates the length of the north, the line is turning the other way. People arriving, homes being built, a language being carried forward by children whose parents could not speak it, chosen rather than inherited, made new in classrooms on the very islands it was supposed to disappear from. Both are the Highlands. Both are true. The place is not one thing, and it is certainly not finished. There is a hardness to this land that 200 years of history have not softened. The soil is still thin, the winters are still long, the distances are still vast, and the far glens are still emptying, and no island buyout or wildcat release or Gaelic school changes the sheer difficulty of holding a community together on the edge of the Atlantic. This is not a story with a tidy ending. The crisis in the Northwest is genuine, and it is now, and it may yet win. But that is not the only thing that is now. It is also now, this year, that the people of 100 glens and islands are choosing, deliberately, against the pull of 2 centuries, to stay, to come back, to build a house where a house has not stood in living memory, to raise children who speak the old language and know the old ground, to own, together, the land their ancestors were driven from. The Highlands were emptied on purpose, and now, in the places that matter most, they are being filled back up on purpose too. Slowly, stubbornly, one family, one township, one island at a time, against the odds and against the history, which may be the most Highland thing of all, that a people cleared from their own land 200 years ago did not vanish. They waited, and when the chance came, they bought it back, and they stayed. This is Scotland, not the empty wilderness of the photograph, the living, contested, stubborn north, still deciding, glen by glen, what it wants to be. Thank you for traveling the Highlands with us. Until the next journey.